London holds many secrets within its ancient, sprawling geography, but none are as dark or as terrifying as the stories trapped within the stone walls of the Tower of London. This fortress has stood for nearly 1,000 years as a symbol of royal power and a grim destination for those who fell out of favor with the crown. The air here feels heavy with the weight of centuries of suffering, and the damp fog from the River Thames often clings to the battlements like a shroud. Visitors who walk these grounds during the day may feel a chill that the sun cannot warm, but those who remain after the gates are locked to experience something far more sinister. It is a place where history refuses to die and the dead refuse to rest. The White Tower stands at the center of the complex, and it dominates the skyline with its imposing Norman architecture. William the Conqueror ordered its construction to subdue the unruly citizens of London, and it has served that purpose with brutal efficiency. The stone used to build these walls was brought from France, and it has absorbed the screams of the tortured and the prayers of the condemned for generations. Every rough-hewn block seems to hold a memory of pain that radiates outward when the sun goes down. The silence that falls over the tower at night is not peaceful, but rather it is the held breath of a predator waiting in the darkness. Access to the fortress from the river was often through the Traitors Gate, which sits low in the water and looms like a gaping maw ready to swallow prisoners whole. Many famous figures passed beneath this grim archway, knowing that they would likely never leave the tower alive. The water laps against the stone steps with a rhythmic sound that mimics the beating of a terrified heart. Even today, the damp smell of the river, mixed with the musty scent of old stone, creates an atmosphere of dread. It was here that prisoners were stripped of their dignity and their hope before being led to their cells to await their violent ends. The most famous spectral resident of the tower is undoubtedly Queen Anne Boleyn, who was the second wife of King Henry VIII. Her rise to power changed the course of religious history in England, but her fall was rapid and absolutely devastating. Accused of adultery and treason and incest, she was imprisoned in the Queen's house before her execution. The charges were almost certainly fabricated to allow the king to marry Jane Seymour. But that did not save Anne from her fate. She spent her final days oscillating between hysterical laughter and deep despair, while she watched the construction of her own scaffold on Tower Green. On the morning of the 19th of May, in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn was led out to the scaffold. She had requested a swordsman from Calais rather than the common axeman because she wanted a swift death. She dressed in a robe of dark gray damask with ermine and wore a white coif over her dark hair. The crowd was silent as she spoke her final words, praising the king who had condemned her to death. She knelt upright, and the French swordsman severed her head with a single stroke. The speed of the blow was meant to be a mercy. Yet the horror of that moment imprinted itself onto the very fabric of the tower. Sightings of Anne Boleyn have been reported for centuries by the yeoman warders and soldiers stationed at the tower. She is most often seen near the Queen's house, where she spent her final days, or walking the grounds of Tower Green. Witnesses describe a woman in Tudor dress, moving silently through the mist. Sometimes she appears whole and beautiful as she was in life, but at other times she manifests as a terrifying figure, holding her own severed head beneath her arm. The head is said to still possess a look of shock and sorrow frozen in the moment of death. One particularly chilling encounter occurred in the 19th century, involving a captain of the guard. He saw a light burning in the chapel royal of St. Peter ad Vincula late at night. Curious and suspicious, he found a ladder and peered through the window to see what was happening inside. He reported seeing a slow procession of knights and ladies dressed in ancient costume moving up the aisle. At the head of the procession walked a woman who resembled Anne Boleyn. But when he looked closer, he realized the figure was headless. The procession vanished moments later, leaving the chapel in total darkness. The chapel royal of St. Peter ad Vincula is the final resting place for many of those executed within the tower, including Anne Boleyn. It has been called the saddest spot on earth by historian Thomas Babington Macaulay. The bodies of queens and saints and traitors lie beneath the flagstones, often thrown into simple arrow chests or mass graves without ceremony. The atmosphere inside the chapel is incredibly dense and heavy. Many visitors report feeling a sudden onset of nausea or an overwhelming urge to weep without reason. It is a place where the barrier between the living and the dead is exceptionally thin. Another tragic figure who haunts these grounds is Lady Jane Grey, known as the 9 Days Queen. She was a pawn in a political game played by ambitious men, and she was executed at the tender age of 16. Jane was held prisoner in the home of the gentleman jailer, and she watched from her window as her husband, Guildford Dudley, was taken out to be beheaded on Tower Hill. She saw his body brought back in a cart, and the sight broke her heart before she was led to her own death on the green. Her innocence and her youth make her story one of the most heartbreaking in the history of the Tower. The execution of Lady Jane Grey was a fumble of panic and tragedy that echoes through time. After she was blindfolded, she lost her bearings and could not find the block. She reached out into the empty air, crying out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A bystander had to step forward and guide her hands to the block. That moment of blind terror seems to replay itself on the anniversary of her death. Guards have reported seeing a small white shape on the battlements on the 12th of February. It is a lonely figure that seems to be searching for something it can never find. Perhaps the most gruesome execution and subsequent haunting is that of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. She was an elderly woman of nearly 70 years when King Henry VIII ordered her execution. She was a Plantagenet and a threat to his lineage, but she refused to go quietly to her death. She stated that she was no traitor and refused to lay her head on the block. The executioner was young and inexperienced, and the scene that followed was a butchery that turned the stomachs of all who witnessed it. When Margaret Pole refused to kneel, the executioner had to chase her around the scaffold, hacking at her with his axe. It took several blows to finally kill her, and she died screaming in agony and defiance. This horrific event is said to replay itself on the anniversary of her death in the precincts of the tower. Witnesses claim to hear the sounds of a struggle and the terrified screams of an old woman echoing off the stone walls. Some have even seen the shadowy figures of the executioner and his victim running in a macabre dance of death that never ends. The Bloody Tower acquired its grim name from the legend of the princes in the tower. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were sent to the tower by their uncle Richard III for their protection, or so it was claimed. The 12-year-old king and his 9-year-old brother were seen playing in the gardens less and less frequently until they disappeared altogether in the summer of 1483. Rumors swirled that they had been murdered to secure their uncle's claim to the throne, but no bodies were found at the time. The fate of the princes remained a mystery for nearly 2 centuries, until workmen demolishing a staircase in the White Tower during the reign of Charles II made a grim discovery. They found a wooden chest containing the bones of 2 small children buried deep within the rubble. The bones were examined and declared to be those of the missing princes before being interred in Westminster Abbey. However, the discovery of their remains did not seem to put their spirits to rest. The Bloody Tower remains one of the most active sites for paranormal phenomena within the entire fortress complex. Guests and guards who stay in the Bloody Tower have reported seeing the ghosts of 2 young boys wearing white nightgowns. They are often seen standing together in the shadows, holding hands as if for comfort. Unlike the violent energy of Margaret Pole or the sorrow of Anne Boleyn, the presence of the princes is described as quiet and intensely sad. They appear to be waiting for a rescue that never came. Some witnesses have reported hearing the sound of children giggling in the dead of night, only for the laughter to be cut short by a sudden stifling silence. The gunpowder plot of 1605 brought Guy Fawkes to the Tower of London as a prisoner. He was a conspirator who planned to blow up the House of Lords and kill King James I. Fawkes was taken to the dungeons of the White Tower and subjected to enhanced interrogation authorized by the king. He was famously tortured on the rack, a device designed to stretch the human body until the joints dislocated and the fibers of muscle tore apart. His agony was prolonged and intense as his captors demanded the names of his co-conspirators. The room where Guy Fawkes was tortured is known as the Council Chamber in the White Tower. It is said that his screams were so loud they could be heard outside the thick stone walls. By the time he signed his confession, his signature was a shaky, illegible scrawl that testified to his broken state. Although he was executed in Old Palace Yard at Westminster, his spirit seems tethered to the place of his greatest suffering. Visitors to the White Tower have reported hearing low groans and the sound of heavy breathing in the council chamber when no one else is there. Another torture device used in the tower was the scavenger's daughter, which crushed the body rather than stretching it. The cell known as Little Ease was designed so that a prisoner could neither stand up nor lie down, preventing any sleep or rest. The psychological trauma inflicted in these dark, damp spaces has left a residue of misery that sensitive individuals can feel to this day. It is a sensation of claustrophobia and panic that rises in the chest and makes it difficult to breathe. The stone walls seem to press in closer, as if trying to crush the life out of the living. Arbella Stewart was a cousin of James, the first who was imprisoned in the tower for marrying without royal permission. She was kept in the Queen's house and spent her time hoping for release or escape. When her plans failed and she realized she would never leave, she refused to eat and slowly starved herself to death. Her ghost is said to haunt the Queen's house, and she has been seen by residents and guests. This spirit is often described as aggressive and angry, famously shoving people or creating sudden cold spots that freeze the air in a room instantly. Even the construction of the tower was plagued by supernatural occurrences. During the expansion of the fortress in the 13th century, a wall collapsed twice without explanation. The builders claimed that the ghost of St. Thomas Becket, who had been murdered in Canterbury Cathedral, was responsible. He was said to be angry that the tower was being expanded at the expense of the people of London. A chapel was dedicated to him within the complex to appease his angry spirit, and the wall was finally completed without further incident. The Salt Tower is another location with a dark reputation. It was used to hold Jesuits and those accused of sorcery. The walls are covered in intricate graffiti carved by prisoners who had years to count the days of their confinement. One carving is a complex horoscope intended to predict the day of a man's death. Visitors to the Salt Tower often report an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Some have described invisible hands touching their shoulders, or the sensation of someone standing directly behind them, breathing on their neck. One of the most bizarre and terrifying accounts comes from the keeper of the Jewel House named E.L. Swift. In 1817, he was having dinner with his family in the Martin Tower when his wife suddenly screamed. Swift looked up to see a cylindrical form, like a glass tube, filled with a swirling blue liquid floating in the air. The object moved around the table and hovered before his wife, who was terrified. Swift threw a chair at the apparition, and it passed straight through the object, striking the wall behind it. The form then vanished into thin air. This strange encounter in the jewel house is often linked to the story of a phantom bear. A sentry guarding the jewel house once reported seeing a massive bear emerge from the shadows. He raised his bayonet and charged the beast, but the blade passed through the animal as if it were made of smoke. The guard collapsed in shock and was found unconscious by his relief. He died 2 days later, never recovering from the fright. It is believed this spectral bear may be a remnant of the royal menagerie, which was once housed within the tower walls. King Henry VI was murdered in the Wakefield Tower while he was at prayer in 1471. He was a pious and gentle man who was unsuited for the brutal politics of the Wars of the Roses. He was stabbed to death on the order of Edward IV. It is said that on the anniversary of his death, his ghost appears in the Wakefield Tower just before midnight. He is seen pacing back and forth and then fading away as the clock strikes the hour. The stone floor where he died is said to be permanently stained with blood that reappears no matter how many times it is scrubbed. Sir Walter Raleigh was one of the most famous prisoners of the Tower, and he spent 13 years confined in the Bloody Tower. He lived in relative comfort compared to others, and was allowed to conduct scientific experiments and write his history of the world. Despite his privileges, he was eventually executed in Old Palace Yard. His ghost is known as one of the more benign spirits of the tower. Guards have reported seeing a figure resembling Raleigh walking along the ramparts, known as the Walk. Sometimes the distinctive smell of pipe smoke lingers in the air long after the figure has vanished. The ravens of the tower are not ghosts, but they are deeply connected to the superstition and dread of the fortress. Legend states that if the ravens ever leave the tower, the White Tower will crumble, and the Kingdom of England will fall. These large black birds watch visitors with intelligent bead-like eyes, and their croaking calls add to the eerie atmosphere. They are the guardians of the tower, and they seem to know the secrets of the dead better than any living person. Their presence serves as a constant reminder of the fragility of the crown and the country. The atmosphere on Tower Green is deceptive. It is a lovely patch of grass that looks peaceful in the daylight, but it is soil that has been soaked in royal blood. This was the site of private executions reserved for those of high rank, to spare them the humiliation of the public crowds on Tower Hill. Standing on this green one can almost hear the muffled drums and the prayers of the condemned. It is a place where the air feels thinner, and the noise of the modern city outside the walls seems to fade into a respectful silence. Night watchmen and yeoman warders who live within the tower walls have a unique relationship with these spirits. They grow accustomed to the unexplained footsteps in the corridors and the doors that open and close on their own. They learn to ignore the sudden drops in temperature and the feeling of being observed. However, there are times when even the most hardened veterans are shaken. There are corners of the tower that the guards' dogs refuse to pass, whining and cowering at something human eyes cannot see. The geography of the tower is bordered by the River Thames, which has played a crucial role in its dark history. The river served as a method of transport for prisoners and a disposal site for the unwanted. The mud of the riverbank has hidden many secrets over the centuries. At low tide, the smell of the river combines with the history of the fortress to create a sensory experience that is both historic and horrifying. The water is a dark mirror that reflects the gray stone walls and the gray skies above. During the day, the tower is filled with the chatter of tourists and the bright flashes of cameras. This activity masks the true nature of the place. But when the last tourist leaves and the heavy wooden gates are bolted shut, the tower undergoes a transformation. The shadows lengthen, and the silence amplifies every creak and groan of the ancient structures. The energy shifts from a museum to a mausoleum. This is the time when the past bleeds into the present, and the spirits of the executed reclaim their territory. The interior of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula is perhaps the most haunted enclosed space in the complex. During excavations in the Victorian era, hundreds of bones were found beneath the floor. They were the remains of forgotten prisoners, mixed with the bones of queens and dukes. The disrespect shown to these remains for centuries has likely fueled the restless energy in the chapel. It is a place of profound sadness where the tragedy of the tower is concentrated into a single room. Catherine Howard was the fifth wife of Henry VIII and another victim of his tyranny. She was young and foolish, and she paid the ultimate price. Before she was taken to the tower, she escaped her guards at Hampton Court and ran down the gallery screaming for the king to have mercy. Her ghost is famously said to haunt Hampton Court, but her energy is also felt at the tower where she met her end. She is a symbol of the ruthlessness that permeates these walls, where youth and beauty were no defense against the axe. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, was executed on Tower Hill for his role in placing Lady Jane Grey on the throne. He is buried in the chapel of St. Peter. His ghost is less frequently seen, but his presence is part of the collective weight of the tower. The political machinations that led him to the block were complex, but the result was the same simple, brutal end. His story is just one of thousands woven into the tapestry of death that covers this fortress. The question remains whether the haunting is caused by the spirits of the dead, or if the stone itself has recorded the trauma. The sheer amount of pain and fear generated within these walls over a millennium has created a psychic scar on the land. It is a concept known as the stone tape theory, where emotional energy is stored in the environment and replayed under the right conditions. The Tower of London is perhaps the strongest example of this phenomenon in the world. If you were to find yourself locked inside the Tower of London after dark, the first thing you would notice is the isolation. Despite being in the center of a modern metropolis, the thick walls cut you off from the safety of the outside world. You would be alone with the history and the horror. The wind whistling through the arrow slits sounds like whispering voices. The shadows cast by the floodlights seem to move with a will of their own. There are accounts of physical contact from the entities in the tower. People have reported the sensation of a rope being tightened around their neck, or a sharp blow to the back of the head. These are not just visual hauntings, but physical assaults that leave bruises and scratches. The entities here are not all benign remnants of the past. Some are angry and confused, and they lash out at the living who dare to intrude on their suffering. The inescapable truth of the Tower of London is that it was built for domination and death. Its primary function was to imprison and to kill. That purpose has left an indelible mark that no amount of renovation or tourism can erase. The ghosts of the tower are not merely folklore. They are the spiritual consequences of tyranny. They serve as a warning that the past is never truly gone, and that violence leaves a stain that time cannot wash away. As the fog rolls in off the Thames once more, enveloping the White Tower in a cold gray embrace, one can easily imagine the figures of the past stepping out of the mist. The headless queen, the murdered princes, the screaming countess, and the tortured conspirator all play their parts in this eternal tragedy. The Tower of London stands as a monument to history, but it also stands as a prison for the souls who can never leave. The gates are locked, the guards are posted, but the real residents are already inside, waiting for the darkness